The Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Matthew.
Glory to you, O Lord.
When the Pharisees heard that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together. And one of them, a scholar of the law, tested Jesus by asking, "Teacher, which commandment in the law is the greatest?" Jesus said to him, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the greatest and the first commandment. The second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. The whole law and the prophets depend on these two commandments." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
Les Miserables will soon be available to people who love to go to the theater here in Grand Rapids, and I will leave it to your own investigative powers to find out when that will take place. But in that great play, at a certain point, Jean Valjean speaks as he dies to his daughter and to his then ghost-like wife, because she too has died. And his last words are, "And remember the truth that once was spoken, to love another person is to see the face of God." It is pure poetry, but it's always been one of my favorite spots in that wonderful musical. Why? Because I believe it. When you love another person, yes, indeed, you do reach out and touch the face of God. Why? Because we are, after all God's creation. And so when we love each other, we find something of God in all we do. Jesus was wonderfully aware of that. So is the gospel. And so when the Pharisees realize that they can't trap Jesus, apparently they send the Sadducees to do the same thing. And so one of the Sadducees says to Jesus, "And what is the greatest commandment?" And we probably think to ourselves, boy, that came from out of nowhere. What's the difference? Why do we have to know the greatest commandment? Well, Jesus, as we remind ourselves again and again, is a Jew. And he understands the scriptures beautifully. And he knows that there are, for the Jewish people of his time and even today, more than 600 laws that are to be followed by a person practicing their Jewish faith. And so, out of all of that, 600 laws, what is the greatest commandment? And Jesus, because he's very good with the scriptures, goes back to Deuteronomy. And he says there, the great Shema. Shema means in Hebrew, hear. And Jesus gives the Shema to the Sadducee. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone. Therefore, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your strength. Take to heart these words which I enjoin on you today. Drill them into your children. Pretty strong stuff. And so Jesus quotes that as being the most important of these two very, very important commandments. Love God. And then he says, and of course, there is another. And this one comes from Leviticus. In it, Jesus, the law says to the people of God, thou shalt love your neighbor as yourself. Now, of those two loves, I often think the easier one is loving God. Why? Because we can't touch God. God doesn't come up and rub himself against us. God doesn't tick us off. God doesn't cause us to be frustrated. If you do that one more time. So it's a little, I believe, easier to love God. Yesterday, when I was driving up to Notre Dame for the game, I had a friend of mine with me from Memphis. And as we were driving along, even though it was raining, he said, John, this Michigan is beautiful. And I said, yes, it is. And I thought, that's how we see God. When we see the beauty of even Route 96 going up to Notre Dame, when we see that beauty along the road now, all that color, it draws us to the God who created it. And so we can give our love to God. Loving our neighbor, that's a little tougher project. And why? Well, because our neighbor is there and can indeed do all those things that kind of get in the way. And as a nation, and probably as a world, we have given way to individualism. The philosophers will say that we are more involved with ourselves and taking care of ourselves than we are with anything else. And I was trying to think about an example of individualism that might strike us all, and it came in this morning's newspaper, believe it or not, where a woman does an article in the review section of the New York Times saying, when I came from Britain, I was so lonely that I went on my phone to get a self-help app, and I couldn't believe that there were more than 1,000 of them. And she went through using all the apps that say, you are okay, you are wonderful, remember, you are happy, be happy. And she said, it didn't do a thing for me. And so she reached out beyond her app, oh, wow, to other people. What a thought. And in that reaching out to other people and finding friends, she began to become alive again. She went out and loved her neighbor, and her neighbor loved her back. What a novel idea. Except Jesus said it a couple of thousand years ago. Love your neighbor as you love yourself. And so we have to ask ourselves, who is our neighbor? Yes, they are the people who live on the same street that we all live on. Yes, they are the people that we meet at the marketplace and say hello to, or do we anymore? Yes, they are the people who are all around us, but they are also the people living in North Korea, and they are the people who are living in many spots in Africa that are being totally consumed by starvation. And they are the people who live in Iceland who seem to have a difficult time growing trees. Our neighbors are everywhere. And you say, well, I can't get a hold of all of that. Give me a break, man. But when we are caring, when we are concerned about others, then we need to think about these people too. And a little closer to home, our neighbors are the people who are homeless and walk up and down the streets, particularly here on Division Street, right here beside the cathedral. They are our neighbors, and we should refer to them as our neighbors because they are. And in the first reading today, we hear the Lord God saying to the people, don't push aside other people who are exiles. Guess what? You were exiles once too in the land of Egypt, and only because I have led you into the promised land are you able to be the people you are. Don't push away the refugees, the people who come to us and to our shores to become our neighbors. Remember, when you love someone, you touch the face of God. And we are called to love our neighbors. Called by Jesus to give love to other people, to go outside ourselves, to say no to society that is calling us to live individual lives where we are all by ourselves. Push that aside. Push aside the individualism that is oftentimes crippling us. Be instead what Jesus calls us all to be, Christians. People who follow Jesus and Jesus' commands. And Jesus' command is that we should love our God and we should love our neighbor as we love ourselves.